Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Automotive News Congress Conversation. I'm Hannah Lutz, Deputy Editor for Technology and Innovation at Automotive News, coming to you from our studio in Detroit. Automotive News Supplier reporter John Irwin joins me from his home office today. Hi, John.
Hi.
Today, we'll ask a group of experts about the impact of new trade policy on the auto industry, including reimbursement for auto parts tariffs. Let's welcome our panelists. Sam Fiorani, Vice President of Global Forecasting at AutoForecast Solutions. Hi, Sam.
How you doing?
Laurie Harbour, Partner at Wipfli.
Good morning.
Hi, Laurie. And Kate Kalutkiewicz, Senior Managing Director of the Trade Practice at McLarty Associates. Hi, Kate.
Good morning.
Thanks to all of you for joining us. We want the audience to be a big part of this conversation. So, hey, say hi in the chat and tell us where you're watching. We really want to know what's on your mind and what questions you have. So please put those questions in the chat and we'll answer as many as we can during this live stream. We have lots to cover, so let's begin with the latest. The Trump administration has implemented a series of tariffs over the last few months for the auto industry. For the auto industry, this means 25% levies on imported vehicles and a wide range of automotive parts. Automakers and suppliers had been asking the government for relief and got some on April 29th. The Trump administration said that auto and parts tariffs would no longer stack with certain duties, such as the tariffs on steel and aluminum. The government also said that automakers can apply for a partial reimbursement on parts tariffs for 2 years. So before we get into our questions, let's break down how that reimbursement will work. The Trump administration will allow partial reimbursement for components that make up 15% of a vehicle's value for 1 year and 10% for the second year. Only vehicles built in the U.S. are eligible. Automakers can apply for the reimbursement equal to 3.75% of the aggregate sticker price of their vehicles that are assembled in the U.S. The reimbursement drops to 2.5% the next year and then will be phased out. Okay, so now that we've laid the groundwork, let's get into it. Laurie, I want to start with you. You work with a lot of suppliers, and what do they think about this reimbursement? Is this enough relief for them?
Well, on the supplier side, it's a little bit more challenging. And a lot of the work I do is sort of with some, tier ones, but also some tier two and tier three suppliers. So in some cases, they don't, first of all, necessarily know how to navigate that tariff. When you're a smaller $50 million, $100 million company, all of what's going on beyond just the auto tariffs, but China tariffs and Canada, Mexico, everything is sort of overwhelming for them, right? So for them to kind of understand this has become a significant challenge. And of course, when you feel like you understand it, then it changes quite a bit. So, but certainly there's a feeling of there's some relief that for them as suppliers, the benefit becomes the more relief the OEMs get, that means hopefully that car sales don't slow down and that we can sell more cars, which means parts for them, right? So those are the things they're trying to navigate and understand within their space.
And how are they really strategizing? Like, what does their day-to-day look like when it comes to tariffs?
For the companies that I work with, it's very chaotic. Trying to understand just their HTS codes, where my metal is, melted or smelted, and understanding the implication for their product alone, much less this cross-border between Mexico, Canada, and many of those small suppliers, ironically, don't even know where some of their parts end up on the final product of a vehicle. I have a customer that makes seatbelt buckles. They make $2 million a year. They don't know that it's made in a GM plant in, San Luis in Mexico. They just know that they send it to a tier one supplier. So navigating that and understanding it right now feels like chaos. And in some cases, people are saying that's more painful than the tariff itself.
Wow. Okay. The chaos is very painful.
Mm-hmm.
John, over to you.
Kate, I wanted to ask you, from a trade perspective, do we know how the logistics of this reimbursement are going to play out? I know the Commerce Department is directed to come up with the mechanism over the next 30 days, but do we have an idea of what that reimbursement process might look like, and what will that entail?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one I think that has bedeviled many industries as they've tried to navigate all of these new tariffs around what we consider administrability, right? And generally, Customs and Border Protection is responsible for how tariffs are applied, who's paying the tariffs, how reimbursements are applied. The new arrangement the president put out last week is quite novel, of course, in the sense that it's not it's not necessarily the importers getting credit, it's the OEMs. And so I think at present what's happening is quite a lot of in-depth discussion between those representing the OEMs and the Commerce and Customs departments trying to sort out exactly how this will work.
Gotcha.
And Sam, we also talked about the non-stacking of tariffs that was announced. We had the parts reimbursement and also the non-stacking. Some tariffs on parts previously stacked with steel and aluminum. How much does that non-stacking now benefit the industry?
Well, with metals coming from Canada, from Mexico, these items would have, under the original plan, been tariffed multiple times because you're getting Canadian metals and then a Canadian part, and if it comes across the border multiple times, you'll see the stacking of these tariffs, and it could multiply that tariff many times. By not doing that now, we're at a one-time tariff, so now the part suppliers are not being burdened by all this trouble that the stacking would have provided. It's just a very complex system, and it was overly complex to start with.
Sure. And we know that automakers and trade groups have been to Washington. They've been lobbying the White House to make some of these changes. Kate, I want to go to you for this one. What do these changes, the non-stacking and the parts reimbursement, what do they say about the relationship between the Trump administration now and the auto industry? Do they give the industry more certainty or clarity long term?
Well, look, I think it shows that they're listening, right? I think you're right. I mean, lots of interested parties have descended on Washington and gotten audiences with the White House, with Congress, with others. And I think that this change, while of course not perfect and while of course confusing, it still reflects a point of view that the auto sector, particularly the North American auto sector, because we haven't talked about the exemptions for USMCA, which also remain in place. The president, I think, understands now that to support American auto manufacturing, he has got to come up with some allowances to either allow for some time to change these supply chains, to allow for the continued strength of North America to support the industry. And so, for me, these are all very positive signs that at least in the auto sector, because of course, these are the first major changes that he's granted since he's made all of these announcements. Along with today's announcement with the UK that they're going to be given some preference on autos. We see some movement. So I think altogether, there's still work to be done, no doubt. But altogether, this is a positive signal from the White House.
Okay, and I'm glad you brought up USMCA. We're going to get deeper into USMCA later. And you also mentioned the changes to tariffs on the UK that are, I think, being announced right now. So we don't have all the details on that yet, but please follow autonews.com for more, and we'll have that up later today.
Sam, it's been the $1 million question ever since tariffs have been rolled out. But now given all the changes that we've seen over the past few weeks, how do you see the tariffs, especially with the new changes, affecting production and sales forecasts over the course of the year?
It's on multiple levels. We have the production problems with the additional costs, and a lot of suppliers not being able to deal with the additional tariffs that their parts may or may not be burdened with. Once we get past the small suppliers who could potentially could potentially go out of business. These companies are not making a lot of money, and they're not huge companies. They can't weather a lot of financial burdens like this, and so that could slow down production. The larger suppliers are going to have an easier time with it, but it's still going to be a burden to them as well. Once we get past the production issues, then we're going to have less choice, because manufacturers aren't going to see the profitability of making a smaller vehicle that is fully imported. These vehicles coming from South Korea and Mexico are uh, are built there because of the lower costs, and in order to get the entry level models that the American market is looking for, they simply can't build them in the U.S. without increase in automation or cuts in worker pay, and neither one of those is going to fly with the UAW.
Following up on that a bit, tuning into supplier earnings calls over the past couple of weeks, and it seems like for the ones that at least haven't pulled their guidances, the ones that continued did sort of cut back a little bit on their expectations for North American production this year. Imagine for some people that might be maybe a surprise, just since on the base level, the idea of the tariffs is to attract more manufacturing into the U.S. But at least for this year, we're expecting at least some sort of pullback in production in the region. Can you walk us through, why vehicle production, in the region might be on the decline this year compared to maybe what people were expecting before toward the start of the year?
Yeah, the vehicles produced in Mexico or Canada are going to cost more. So reducing those vehicles being produced simply because the cost has to be passed on to the consumer, and the consumer may not see a minivan from Canada or an Equinox from Mexico being worth the extra money that would be layered on top of the regular price. Once we get past that, then the market itself will decrease in size, and we simply can't move these production facilities to the U.S. as quickly as the tariffs laid out initially. If people within the industry understand that, it's the people outside of the industry who simply don't understand how much time, how much money, how much effort it takes to build a plant, to establish a plant, to move in the suppliers. All these things move in concert with each other and take a long time. It's going to take 3 or 4 years before we can get a greenfield plant up and running with new production. It just doesn't happen overnight. So in the meantime, we're going to see lower sales and lower production, especially in the U.S.
And if I might add to that, Sam, that's assuming they find the workforce, right? And even Treasury Secretary Bessent, I mean, despite some in the Trump administration asserting that we want every job in the United States, Secretary Bessent has said recently, we don't want the jobs of yesterday. We want the jobs of the future, right? And we have to be very, I think, clear-eyed that some of the jobs in the supply chain, particularly in the auto parts sector, are not automated yet, right? They are very intensive, and probably we'd have some trouble finding people to do that work here in the United States.
Right. So it takes the financial investment of potentially a new facility or adding production at an existing facility, and then also finding the labor. What else? Is there anything else that describes like really what it will take for automakers to move production? And then I'll ask about suppliers specifically too.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's clear too. This audience knows well that the auto parts companies sometimes are beholden to the decisions of the OEMs. If they have to localize right next door, if they have to have production in a certain way to support the OEMs, this isn't a decision necessarily that our auto parts companies can make independent. So again, it's very interesting that like with the exceptions, I mean, we've just given all the power to the OEMs, which, assuming great power comes great responsibility, I think they'll probably try to do their best. But it does need to be, I think, a discussion among the entire supply chain so that everybody is working together.
Kate brings up the point of the just-in-time production, where a manufacturer is, the supplier has to be nearby. And if you have production in Mexico, there are suppliers right there. The whole point is to bring those parts in as quickly as possible, as soon as the production is ready for them, so there's no warehousing, so that the vehicles can be built as economically as possible. And if you relocate that production from, say, Mexico to the United States, well, now you have to find new suppliers. You have to find a new just-in-time system that relocates that production to the U.S. A Mexican-built vehicle could have 60, 70, 80% local content, and all those suppliers need to be located in the U.S. to avoid the tariffs on what would be a low-cost or low profit vehicle.
Right. Laurie, how are you seeing this from the supplier perspective? Are they trying to kind of become just in time, trying to move more production to the US? Um, we talked a bit yesterday. You talked about a lot of the quoting they're having to do for the automakers. So, what's going on from that side?
It's a tremendous upheaval for them on the quote side. But just to add one thing about the OEM side, you got to remember we've got incredibly underutilized OEM facilities already in the North American market. So I've got plants that were supposed to be converted to battery electric vehicle plants that are sitting at 10% utilization. So imagine being the person who has to make a decision at GM or Ford to say, well, let's redo that plant, get rid of our BEV strategy, build a new plant, leave a plant sitting in Mexico open. I mean, running an assembly plant is an incredibly large capital investment. So we're already sitting at this incredible underutilization of capacity because we've never returned to that 18 million unit mark since pre-COVID, right? So now you look at the supplier base, and right now what we're seeing across hundreds of companies we've talked to in the last 2 months, particularly in the last 2 weeks, quote activity is up about 30 to 40%, but probably 90% of it's not real.
Hmm.
It's quote activity. I mean, I just talked to a major OEM this morning. They're quoting everything in the US to find out, one, is it worth the dollars to move it? Because what Kate's saying about people is important. What Sam's saying about the UAW cost to build those parts is important. So even with a tariff, can I, in some countries, continue to produce those parts and still make it cheaper than the US because they don't have the capacity, the people, or the cost structure to support that going into the vehicle? Now, it's a separate discussion with China tariffs because the tariff is so large right now. But if I'm making something in Mexico, can I truly make it cheaper here in the US when you factor in the difference in labor costs? So most suppliers are not knee-jerk reacting to some of it. I know you've heard of some movement by a couple tier ones and some layoffs, and the administration likes to take credit for that being, that they were the reason that those announcements were being made. And in some cases, some of those announcements were planned anyways. So I don't think anybody's really knee-jerk reacting. And to Sam's point, I mean, moving an assembly plant is 2 to 3 years alone, or converting an assembly plant. It may be easier for a molder to move a mold out of Mexico and bring it to the US, but the question is ultimately where the OEMs will decide that part and that vehicle needs to be made. So it continues the theme of chaos. How do I
Sure.
make that decision in the current environment when it could all change in 6 weeks or later?
Right. Good point. We have a question from one of our viewers on LinkedIn. They're asking, how do you respond to supplier price or cost breakdown requests if you've been getting those? So that would include separate raw material costs, labor, SGA, profit. Um, have you gotten those requests? Anybody on the call?
You
Or
mean
how
to
would you respond?
you mean to do financial modeling of part movement? Is that what that means?
Yes. Like how would you model it? I think is the
Yeah.
point of the question.
We're doing a lot of that for our customers, people who are, first of all, mapping our supply chain, understanding where things are located, understanding what the tariff is by country at the 10% level today and what it was originally announced to that's been put on pause, right? And then doing the financial modeling and that's where the quote activity is coming from. So if I have a part in India, let's quote that part here in the US. Let's see how much that's going to cost us to move it. Do I have to create new tooling to move that part, or can I move the tools? So it's a real full financial cost model to evaluate it country by country and helping people make a make buy decision based on other countries and other suppliers that they could move it to, right? We make the tariff high enough in China, we just move the cheese, right? I mean, does that mean it moves to the US or does it move to India or Vietnam? It's you just have to model every aspect, and the labor piece will be the most important.
Sam, as in the long run, as companies maybe look at, how to resource into the U.S., are they looking? You think they're looking more at building from scratch, or maybe more brownfield development, or are we looking at, signs of, collaboration or maybe shared capacity with other companies? I guess what sort of developments might companies be looking at? What's realistic when they look at resourcing?
From the OEM side, as Laurie pointed out, these plants, while they may be underutilized today, have product planned for them. They're ramping up electric vehicles. They're moving into something else, and there aren't a lot of plants that don't have something earmarked for them in the next year, 2 or 3. So finding saying that is simply that they're underutilized just doesn't look at the long term, that it takes a while to put in the tooling and everything to build up these plants. We are seeing some shuffling of product around right now. We're likely to see more in the near future, as the transition to EVs has been a lot slower than the manufacturers thought, and they don't need these extra plants. So some of these plants are being recast as hybrid or internal combustion engine vehicles. We're seeing that already, and more are absolutely going to come along. We're expecting to see a couple announcements very shortly of retooling of plants, but because they've already invested the money to move towards whatever product they planned previously, that now has there's going to have to be a bigger investment to move that to something else. So we're going to see hundreds of millions, and in some cases billions of dollars of reinvestment in these plants to retool them for what is desired by the public going forward. And some of that product will be resourced from Canada or Mexico or somewhere else.
Sam, a follow up to that is that are automakers thinking of that as a long-term strategy or something to get through the next however long, 3 to 5 years or just 3 years?
Well, they're obviously not going to say that it was a short-term plan.
Mhm.
Uh, the idea that the Trump administration is only going to last another 3 and just under 4 years means that somebody else will be in power in 4 years, and we may get a revised USMCA plan, something else that would reinvigorate the automotive industry that requires all three of these countries to be globally competitive. That this is an area, a region of the world that the U.S. cannot properly compete with the EU and then with China. So if they can utilize the assets of all three countries, suddenly we're on the same footing with a combined EU and making globally competitive products. Uh, a lot of these manufacturers have to make that $100 million, $500 million investment in a plant for a longer term. You can't just say this is the move we're going to make for the next 4 years, because it won't pay itself off. But they may be one generation of vehicle or 2 generations of vehicle before they move to something else longer term.
Okay. We got a question from the audience for Laurie from LinkedIn. How do you see the tariffs and the adjustments affecting the mold, tool, and die automation industries?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's a really positive thing right now for these tool suppliers in that the tariff on China is 170% on dies and molds and 145 on die cast tools. So it's substantially higher than the 25% it was pre-Trump administration this time. The challenge right now is that the other countries have been ramping up tool building facilities. And so you've got some people who've moved from China to Vietnam, to Indonesia, to India. So they have a tariff, but lesser of a tariff. The challenge goes back to what we said a few minutes ago is we've lost a tremendous amount of tooling capacity just in the last 6 years of the North American market. And I mean, probably $1 billion to $2 billion worth of tool capacity is just closed, not moved, but closed. So the challenge is people and skilled labor to be able to make these tools. Most critical first step of any product in a car. Every product has a tool, a die, a mold, a die cast tool. So it's a very positive thing, but I don't believe that it's going to stick at that level long term. I think it's going to come down potentially to 70% in the coming, post July timeframe. And it right now it's an opportunity, but the problem is I don't have any demand for tooling right now because of what Sam mentioned. A lot of the programs have been delayed and they're going to retool these plants. And so the demand for automotive tooling is quite low right now. And it's about half of what it was 8 years ago. So it's a substantial problem. But we do have we have very good tool suppliers here in North America that are ready to pick up some of that capacity, and we need some commitment from the OEMs to source those tools here and keep these companies alive, because we need these tool makers in this country to support our production of vehicles.
Okay. We've talked about China quite a bit. Kate, here's a question from the audience on LinkedIn. How will tariffs on China and China's retaliation affect the U.S. auto industry long term?
Well, it's hard to know what the tariffs are going to look like even beyond this weekend. Look, I think in general the tariff sort of burden is gonna continue to change. I mean, I think that this is back to the point of knowing your supply chains very well and knowing where you can move things around, because I mean, today's status quo could be very different from next week or even beyond this 90-day period. So on China, I mean, look, I think that the president has signaled an interest clearly in bringing down this tariff rate. I mean, you know, essentially, on average, we have 145% tariffs on all imports from China. He's facing quite a lot of pressure to bring those down. There could be a situation after trade talks this weekend in Switzerland between the United States and China where we bring that rate down. Now, it won't go down to where it was, but it will be lower. I think that the president and his economic team as well have started to pick up that, the fact that there are only 10% tariffs on countries like Vietnam and frankly the rest of the world, as we have this 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs, have created an incentive to manufacture there, because it's cheaper to manufacture in Vietnam and ship to the United States, even with a 25% tariff, than if you are paying 145% tariffs on inputs from China. So there may also be a shift in elevating tariff rates in certain economies beyond the 90 days if progress is not made. So I think it's a little difficult to predict beyond the fact that the unpredictability is here to stay, and the Trump administration has been very clear that that's part of their plan, the unpredictability. I think they would say the only thing certain is that manufacturing in the United States will be the safest place for you to be if you want to avoid tariffs. We dance around North America again. I think, as Sam said, there is recognition in the administration that among all of the sectors they've identified as critical sectors for manufacturing, if they want to compete with China, if they want to compete with Europe, they are going to have to work with our North American partners to create an ecosystem that enables us to do that, at least in the immediate term. I think the case can be made that that's a long-term investment they ought to be considering.
Sure. And Kate, one more for you on USMCA's come up quite a few times as well. How should we think about the tariffs leading into USMCA renegotiations? How do you expect the landscape could change, and what do you think Canada and Mexico may ask for?
Well, I mean, I think USMCA, although was clearly a priority at the beginning of the administration, has now fallen a bit behind the rest of these negotiations. So that's a bit of a reprieve. Of course, the review is not up until 2026. What I'd like to point out, of course, is that the president often touts USMCA as the greatest trade deal ever negotiated. Of course, he did it. And this week, the Canadians were here in Washington, and they gave a very good performance. I mean, it was a great meeting. It was a great signal exercise that USMCA remains very, very strong. A lot of press was given to the president's comments on it being a transitional agreement, but of course he also said USMCA is good for everyone, and that's about the best thing I've ever heard him say about a trading relationship. Now, as we move into the review, I think what the United States in particular will seek are an expansion of the types of rules that they negotiated the first time around on autos, to ensure that there is some value content, that the North American preferential relationship benefits North American producers and suppliers, not those that might seek investments in Mexico to gain entry to the United States, not those that send inputs. And so I think tightening rules around content, around rules of origin, as we call it in trade agreements, I think are going to be of interest to the United States. Canada and Mexico, of course, still have this longstanding challenge on autos when it comes to the rules of origin. But I don't think the United States is going to give on that. And I don't think Mexico and Canada will push very hard either. So we'll have to see what comes. But I mean, I think it remains a strong agreement.
Okay. Yeah, we'll
Actually,
see.
and one other thing I would add, which is of interest to the USMCA discussions and probably some listening, are that the administration has focused intently on the Western Hemisphere generally as a value chain they'd like to see grow beyond USMCA. If what they want is for suppliers and companies to move out of Asia, they have signaled that the Western Hemisphere is where they'd like them to go. And there has been discussion around CAFTA in particular, graduation of certain countries there that perhaps have made some good economic choices that are moving closer to the USMCA agreement. And I think there will be an openness to those sorts of talks as well.
Okay. So we're running out of time, but we still have some questions from the audience. Are any of you able to stick with us for a little longer?
Sure.
Okay, great.
Sure.
Kate, I know that you might have to run. So if you need to drop off, please go ahead. So I want to stick with USMCA. John, can you explain some of the tariff exemptions and then get into our next question?
Yeah, that's been a major focus for the industry over the last couple of weeks as parts tariffs have come into effect. As of right now, parts that comply with the USMCA and its regional content rules and everything else are still able to cross the border and trade duty-free, which is, I know, a big relief for a lot of automakers and suppliers as they try to keep the flow of parts moving. But there was some confusion about if that exemption is that permanent? Is it only temporary while they come up with a way to tariff only the non-US content in those parts? And that's something a lot of companies have been trying to figure out. Sam, in your conversations, does the industry expect this USMCA parts exemption to be permanent, or might they eventually be subject to a tariff on non-US content? I guess sort of what's the industry thinking at the moment?
As Kate pointed out, there's a renegotiation plan for next year for USMCA, and in all likelihood, this will be part of the conversation. This will be a major part of the conversation on the automotive side. We don't see the excuses that the administration has made for applying tariffs on top of USMCA plan seems kind of weak at this moment, and we just need to see how deep they're going to go on this national security side to tariff parts that were previously covered under a free trade agreement. So finding some answers to that is up to the administration.
Okay. We have another question from LinkedIn for Laurie. Given that wire harness manufacturing is labor intensive, requiring a large, low skilled workforce, is the U.S. realistically able to host such operations domestically under current labor market conditions? And is Mexico a sufficient solution for nearshoring the operations amid the tariffs?
Yeah, there's already a lot of wire harness manufacturing in Mexico, right? So it certainly is very labor intensive. There are opportunities for some aspect of automation. We've seen some of those, but this is that conversation of earlier, right? I mean, what is the tariff ultimately going to be? How will it apply to USMCA exclusion to be able to put that in Mexico and then support the North American market through a free trade agreement? Finding the people that want to do those kinds of jobs, as Kate pointed out earlier in the call, is really challenging. And being able to do that at a cost structure that we're in, our wages have gone up every year since COVID to the tune of 5% based on our data for hourly workforce. So you're talking about jobs that are quite expensive in comparison to the cost model that they might be in low-cost countries or even in Mexico. So I do think it's viable, and I think it's a big portion of the value content of the vehicle that could be, come through with this, free trade agreement. One comment about USMCA that I would add that maybe it's slightly different than my peers on the panel. I think USMCA is going to happen way before next year. We have to remember there's a political aspect to a new election coming next fall, where we have the House and the Senate up for re-election in many cases. We were with a lobbyist this week, all week, and in our work last week in Washington, and all indications are that this will probably start to have a negotiation later this fall to get an agreement in place sooner rather than later, which is also tied to the Canadian-Mexican tariffs, right? So I think it happens in collaboration with that activity.
Sure, and that would give the industry some more clarity more quickly, hopefully.
Right.
Sam, the parts tariff reimbursement that was laid out last week is based on an aggregate of the manufacturer's suggested retail price, also known as MSRP or sticker price. Why would the government use MSRP in that equation rather than the value or cost of the part? Does using the MSRP benefit the automaker in some way?
MSRP is a published number. If you're a manufacturer of a part, there are ways around how much the part costs, how much this component costs, how much this value of the part comes from Canada or Mexico or India or anywhere else. But MSRP is a static number. It is a number that is published by every magazine and every website and every manufacturer. So it's an easier number to go by and a more static number than everything else.
Makes sense. And how does using MSRP for this reimbursement calculation, how might that impact the consumer?
The potential of raising the price to get a higher drawback on that incentive, that tariff, is always out there, and we're seeing a lot of price changes being blamed on the tariff, even if it may not be. But this is a reason to get a little more money out of the consumer when consumers already being burdened by a $50,000 vehicle and 7-year loans and being underwater on existing loans. It's an additional burden to the industry, and one that can't be overlooking the entry-level models that would disappear if all production had to move to the United States. Just would escalate all those issues.
Laurie, a lot has been made in recent years about supply chain visibility and the need for automakers and tier one suppliers to know what's going on deep in their supply chains with the tier two, tier threes. It seems like that will be put to the test now. How would you assess the industry's supply chain visibility, and how does it compare now to even before the pandemic?
Better today in terms of visibility than it was pre-pandemic, right? The pandemic created a whole new look at it. I mean, really, frankly, back in 08 and 09 is when it really started to be a pressure of, hey, where is my supply base? Where do they need to be? But really elevated in COVID, but certainly something that we are seeing like crazy in the last 6 months. I work with a lot of tier two suppliers, so they're getting phone calls from their tier one suppliers. They're not tier one supplier customers, people who are interested to know where they are and where their content is. So the OEMs are asking tier ones to get deep into their supply base, in some cases even down to those rare earth minerals of where we're getting the steel and where we're getting the die cast, molten aluminum and magnesium and things of that nature. So there's a lot of pressure. It's probably not a job I would want today, working within the purchasing department of one of these tier ones, but again, each level you go down in the supply base, you create more chaos because they don't have the people to even track some of that. The group I was with this week said, I don't know where my metals, melted. I have no idea. Right. So those aspects will become a greater issue. The quote activity is creating some of that. Where would you make it? Do you have a plant in Mexico? So if I'm sourcing a part from China, I may want to know, you, Mr. Supplier, I know you're in the US, but do you also have a plant in Mexico in case I choose to move it there? So there's a lot of supply chain mapping going on and a lot of chaos in just understanding where things are at.
Okay. John, do you have one final question for Sam and Laurie?
Yeah, if for both of you, industry has been lobbying for relief for a long time. They finally got at least a form of it recently. What other forms of relief might automakers and suppliers advocate for moving forward now?
As we discussed before, a quicker renegotiation of USMCA. The industry likes stability. And so making sure we have in writing what the plan is going forward, everybody can make their investments, everybody can make their plans for production. If we have to deal with ongoing negotiations with every country around the world, especially the North American ones, it just will slow down this industry. It'll slow down the economy. It'll increase prices. We have a lot of issues that will snowball if these things aren't settled quickly.
I agree with Sam. I mean, the biggest concern I have with tariffs, and I'm not implying they're all bad, but the biggest concern I have is at a broad brush, there's an impact we're going to start to see in our economy and the consumer. I mean, Sam talked about, we partner with AFS. They're showing data of 50,000 on average for the cost of a vehicle. The average consumer can't afford that vehicle, right? And inflation and economy, and that's a big capital purchase. So, and a consumer may wait, just like then a manufacturer may wait on their capital. So the big thing for me is I'm all about jobs in America. I mean, it's what I do every single day and helping companies drive jobs to America. We need now the support from the government to find the labor, to train the labor. The Small Business Administration needs to support these companies to be able to bring this work back here. So if we can fundamentally agree that it's financially viable to move a product from China or Indonesia or even Mexico or Canada into the US, that's great. But we have to have the support for our manufacturing base. There are many other countries that support their manufacturing industry way more than the US does. So we have to free up I love the mantra of bring jobs back to America, but now we've got to help people invest. Some of that also comes with customer commitment, right? I talk about my tool and die industry. If we could get the OEMs to commit to even buying 25% of their capital in the US as opposed to China, then that would give commitment to work. That then makes me as a business owner say, now I'll invest in people and capital. So we need some of that commitment to come back.
All right, good message. Thanks, Laurie. Thanks, Sam. That'll do it for today. Keep following autonews.com for the latest on tariffs. And we hope to see you in September at Automotive News Congress, where you'll hear more great conversations like this one. Confirmed keynote speakers include General Motors Chair and CEO Mary Barra and Hyundai Motor Group Executive Chair Yisun Chung. You can buy your tickets at autonewsevents.com. Thanks to our Congress Conversations production team, Rudy Shork, Terry Kostrowski, Dean Storm, Jake Neer, Tom Carl, and Tiara Riddick. And thank you to our panelists, Sam Fiorani, Laurie Harbour, and Kate Kalutkiewicz. We really value your time and your insights today. And thanks to the audience for tuning in. For John Irwin and the rest of the Automotive News team, I'm Hannah Lutz. See you next time.